Howdy readers, I'm Jason, this is Chapter and Verse, and tonight we are going to be looking at the second half of this Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War by Drew Gilpin Faust. And this is for my Mortality class that I'm doing here on my channel this year. So I wanted to start this video by looking at the social ritual of mourning in the 19th century, specifically during the Civil War. So I had always been aware that in the past that the social ritual of mourning involved wearing black. There's a scene in Peter Carey's Oscar and Lucinda where a character is essentially dyeing a kind of peach-colored gown that she has in a vat of ink because she's in mourning for her dead husband. And so I had always been aware of this. What I didn't know was that this social ritual of mourning was dictated by a person's sex, age, and the person that they were mourning, right? Whom they were mourning. Those were the things that essentially governed expectations around the grieving, the public grieving process. And I just wanted to read a bit to you here. So this is on page 148 in the trade paperback edition. By convention, a mother mourned for a child for a year, a child for a parent the same length of time, a sister 6 months for a brother. A widow mourned for 2.5 years, moving through prescribed stages and accoutrement of heavy, full, and half mourning, with gradually loosening requirements of dress and deportment. A widower, by contrast, was expected to mourn only for 3 months, simply by displaying black crepe on his hat or armband. The work of mourning was largely allocated to women. And one of the things that I found most interesting about that was this question, right, which I've written down here in my notes. If, quote, the work of mourning was largely allocated to women, what were men at the time expected to do with their grief? 19 pages later, we are learning about a father named Henry Bowditch, whose son was killed in the Civil War. And Drew Gilpin Faust writes this about him. Bowditch was not prepared for the force of grief that overtook him. In Virginia, to retrieve Nat's body, he sought concealment from others, lest they witness the feelings he could not hide. He judged himself, quote, ill-fitted to see anyone, and was distressed by his, quote, display of unmanliness. And I found all of this interesting, particularly in the kind of contemporary discussion of toxic masculinity, and how much of what we now call toxic masculinity may or may not have its roots, actually, in generations of men essentially not having a socially acceptable and adequate outlet for their grief. And I find that just really, really interesting, right? That there were categories, right? I mean, you mourn for this length of time if this person was killed, and you mourn for this length of time if you were this sex and this person was killed. It all seems very rigid to me, and I just find it very sad that men, for whatever reason, seem not to have been permitted to grieve in any kind of fulfilling way, I guess. So that's just food for thought, I suppose. Next thing I wanted to talk about was the believing and doubting chapter in the book. And I felt like this chapter left a lot to be desired. I felt like it could have essentially borne a lot more kind of careful scrutiny and careful and thorough scholarship. And so here's the thing. As most of you know, if you're new to the channel, maybe you don't know yet, but I'm a religious man. And not only that, but I'm a religious man who is deeply, keenly interested in the history of spiritualism. I talked about this book before on my channel, Deborah Blum's Ghost Hunters, which is about William James and essentially the work that he and his cohorts did in investigating mediums in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in America. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. So I really should have responded more warmly to a chapter that was largely about the kind of religious element to grieving in the Civil War, and also to those people during the Civil War and after the Civil War who felt so desperate that they sought out mediums in efforts to contact the loved ones that they had lost during the war. But she just didn't do a very good job, I felt like, with that material. However, she did a magnificent job of exploring both the literary figures of the time and their relationship to death and the Civil War, as well as the popular fiction of the time, right? So fictions that have been essentially lost to the ages. No one reads these books anymore. And there was one book in particular, and that was, I think she said, was the second best-selling novel of the 19th century in America after Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she does a really fine job of looking at how that popular fiction and how those literary figures were essentially kind of wrestling with and contending with what the public was going through in trying to process just the enormity of what had happened and the number of people who had been killed. She does a particularly fine job, I felt, of discussing Ambrose Bierce, who is a writer we will be talking about again later this year. I won't say in what context, but I had no idea that Bierce had fought in the Civil War, and not only fought in the Civil War, but had fought for a number of years and received a number of commendations until he was finally wounded shortly before the war ended. And then he moved out to California and started a career in journalism and wrote a lot about the Civil War. And what she pulls extracts from in his work is just so powerful that I'm probably at some point this year going to have to spring for the Library of America kind of collected works from Ambrose Bierce. And she does a really fine job as well of situating Emily Dickinson as a kind of Civil War poet, really, and you know, demonstrating for us just how Dickinson may have been influenced by what was happening all around her. And it made me really curious to go back and read more of Dickinson's poetry, which, as you know from an earlier video, I am grossly deficient in. But anyway. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about with this book was the accounting chapter. Okay. And this chapter was devoted principally to American efforts post-Civil War, okay, to disinter the bodies of Union soldiers and relocate them to newly created national cemeteries. So there's a passage on 236 that I wanted to read to you. When the reinterment program was completed in 1871, 303,536 Union soldiers had been buried in 74 national cemeteries, and the War Department had expended $4,306.26 on the effort to gather the dead. Now, what I found so interesting and so disturbing, I suppose, about this chapter was that it was all Union soldiers, Union soldiers, Union soldiers. And it took Drew Gilpin Faust 26 pages. So through the whole chapter, I was thinking, like, all right, there's a big elephant in the room. What about the Confederate dead? And it took her 26 pages to address that. Okay. So the prevailing, the winning, the victorious American government had begun a comprehensive program to locate, disinter, and reinter Union soldiers. But there was no mention in those first 26 pages of the American government including Confederate soldiers in that effort, which I found interesting. So essentially, when she addresses it, we learn that it was largely women's groups, private women's groups in the South, who orchestrated the efforts to collect the dead bodies, to disinter the dead bodies of Confederate soldiers, and to relocate them into kind of hallowed ground. And I suppose why I find this fascinating and disturbing is because it shows, to my mind, a very childish, vindictive bitterness on the part of the Union political machine as was. And I just find it so bizarre that here's this country, right? So the United States of America, the Union, who sacrifices so many Northern troops, the lives of so many Northern men, in an effort to prevent Southern rebels from seceding from the country, in order to keep them as part of the Union. The Union succeeds. It wins. And then it spends the next 6 years through the efforts of reinterring its own dead, essentially thumbing its nose at the dead of the Southern states. And I just found that so odd, so weird. And frankly, it explains a hell of a lot about how racism has persisted in this country. It reminded me a little bit of the little that I know of World War I and what happened directly after World War I, and how Germany was essentially kind of pounded further into the ground after World War I, which then created the conditions for the rise of Adolf Hitler. I suppose I was just shocked to see how death and grieving and attempts to make something dignified of what had been so ugly and so depraved became a kind of wedge, became a kind of tool to beat the people who had lost the war even further down. And I just felt like that was really sad, actually. I don't know how much truth there is to this. I haven't read any Lincoln biographies, and my knowledge of American history is sketchier than it should be. But I have heard in the past that that Lincoln did not want to punish the South beyond how they had already been punished in the war. That if Lincoln had lived, there would have been a more kind of aggressive, graceful, forgiving sense of reconstruction and reintegration of the South with the North. But of course, he was assassinated, and so that never happened. And if that's true, that he wanted that, part of me wonders if Lincoln had lived, if it would have been the position of the U.S. government to pay the same respect to Confederate soldiers as it was paying to Union soldiers who had died during the war. But I suppose we'll never know. Anyway, that's really all I wanted to say about the book. I thought it was terrific. I mean, it had some shortcomings. There were some things that she could have and should have done better. But on the whole, it taught me a hell of a lot that I didn't know before. And that's really what I want from any work of nonfiction. So next month, we will be reading the Pulitzer Prize-winning play, Wit, which is by Margaret Edson. I don't have a copy of it here with me. And we will also be watching, our film for next month will be the movie adaptation of Wit, which is directed by Mike Nichols and stars Emma Thompson. So I anticipate having a video up on the play mid-month in February, and a video up on the film in late February. But for those of you who are just joining the Mortality Project and who are curious about what it is I'm doing this year with this project, I will leave a link to the announcement video in the description box below, as well as the schedule for the remainder of the Mortality Project in 2019. What we'll be reading, what we'll be watching, and when we'll be reading and watching them. So I will talk to you guys again before you know it. Adios.